The year is 1962, and American military transport planes are flying low over the jungles of South Vietnam. They are not dropping bombs. They are spraying chemicals. Millions of gallons of herbicides, toxic compounds designed to kill plants, are being dumped on the Vietnamese countryside. The official justification is military necessity. The Viet Cong hide in the jungle. The jungle provides them cover, concealment, and food. Destroy the jungle, and you destroy the enemy's advantage. It sounds logical. It sounds like modern warfare using science to defeat an elusive enemy. What it actually becomes is one of the greatest environmental and humanitarian disasters in modern history. Over the next decade, nearly 20 million gallons of herbicides will be sprayed across Vietnam. The most common and most toxic of these chemicals will be known by its military designation, Agent Orange, named not for its color, but for the orange stripe on the barrels it came in. This chemical will poison millions of people. It will cause birth defects that persist through generations. It will cause cancers, diseases, disabilities that destroy lives. It will affect not just the Vietnamese civilians and soldiers who were targeted, but also the American soldiers who handled it, who flew through it, who walked through areas that had been sprayed. And when these soldiers and civilians begin to get sick, when their children are born with terrible defects, when they die of rare cancers, the response from the United States government and the chemical companies that manufactured Agent Orange will be denial, delay, and indifference. This is the story of Agent Orange, of how America poisoned millions of people and then spent decades refusing to take responsibility. This is a story about toxic exposure, corporate greed, government negligence, and the human cost of modern warfare. This is a story that is still not over because Agent Orange is still killing people today, decades after the last barrel was sprayed. To understand Agent Orange, you need to understand what it is chemically. Agent Orange is not a single compound. It is a mixture of two herbicides, 24D and 245T, combined in roughly equal proportions. These chemicals are synthetic auxins, artificial plant hormones that cause plants to grow uncontrollably until they exhaust themselves and die. The idea of using herbicides in warfare was not new. Both the British and the Americans had experimented with chemical defoliation during World War II and in Malaysia during anti-insurgency operations in the 1950s. But Vietnam was where herbicidal warfare was used on a massive, unprecedented scale. The mixture that became Agent Orange was manufactured by several major American chemical companies, including Monsanto, Dow Chemical, Diamond Shamrock, Hercules, and others. These companies produced Agent Orange under contract with the Department of Defense, making enormous profits from the war. The problem with Agent Orange is not just the herbicides themselves, though those are toxic. The real problem is a contaminant, a byproduct of the manufacturing process. When you make 245T, you inevitably produce small amounts of dioxin, specifically a compound called 2,3,7,8-tetrachlorodibenzo-P-dioxin, or TCDD. This is one of the most toxic substances ever created by human beings. TCDD is toxic at parts per trillion. To put that in perspective, a single drop in an Olympic-sized swimming pool would make the entire pool dangerous. TCDD does not break down easily. It persists in soil, in water, in human fat tissue for years, decades, generations. It causes cancer. It causes birth defects. It disrupts the endocrine system. It damages the immune system. It affects neurological development. The Agent Orange used in Vietnam was contaminated with TCDD at levels far higher than would be allowed in any commercial product. Some batches contained TCDD at concentrations of 50 parts per million or higher. This meant that every gallon of Agent Orange sprayed over Vietnam contained enough dioxin to cause serious harm. The military operation that used Agent Orange was called Operation Ranch Hand. It began in 1962 as an experiment and expanded into a full-scale program that lasted until 1971. The motto of Operation Ranch Hand was chillingly appropriate. Only we can prevent forests. The aircraft used were C-123 providers, large transport planes fitted with spray equipment. They would fly at low altitude, just a few hundred feet above the jungle canopy, releasing a mist of herbicide behind them. A single pass could spray a path 300 feet wide and several miles long. The planes flew in formations to cover larger areas. Over the course of the operation, these planes flew thousands of missions, spraying millions of gallons of Agent Orange and other herbicides across South Vietnam. The target areas were primarily the jungles and forests where the Viet Cong operated. The Chi Minh Trail, the supply route from North Vietnam through Laos and Cambodia into South Vietnam, was heavily sprayed. The dense jungle along rivers and canals was sprayed. The forests in the Central Highlands were sprayed, but the spraying was not limited to military targets. Agricultural land was deliberately targeted to destroy crops and force rural populations into areas controlled by the South Vietnamese government. This was part of a strategy to deny the Viet Cong food and popular support. Rice paddies were sprayed, rubber plantations were sprayed, farms were sprayed, villages were sprayed. The American military claimed they only targeted areas with no civilian population, but this was a lie. Vietnam was densely populated. There was no such thing as an uninhabited area in most of South Vietnam. Millions of civilians lived in the areas that were sprayed. The immediate effects of Agent Orange exposure were sometimes visible within days. Plants withered and died, trees lost their leaves, the jungle turned brown and gray. Within weeks, the forest canopy was gone, exposing the ground below. The military considered this a success. Enemy forces had nowhere to hide, but the environmental damage was catastrophic. The forests did not grow back quickly. Some areas remained barren for decades. The loss of tree cover led to erosion, washing away topsoil. The soil that remained was contaminated with dioxin. Rivers and streams were contaminated. The fish died. The wildlife disappeared. Entire ecosystems were destroyed. For the Vietnamese people living in these areas, the effects were more than environmental. People reported feeling sick after spraying, experiencing rashes, nausea, dizziness, difficulty breathing. These symptoms were dismissed by American authorities as minor and temporary, but the real effects were not immediate. The real effects took years to become apparent, and when they did appear, they were devastating. Cancer rates in sprayed areas began to climb. Soft tissue sarcomas, rare cancers that affect muscles and connective tissue, lymphomas and leukemias, liver cancer, prostate cancer, lung cancer. These cancers appeared at rates far higher than in unsprayed areas, but even more horrifying were the birth defects. Children born after the spraying began were different. Some were born without limbs, without eyes, without functioning organs. Some had severe neurological problems, unable to walk, speak, or think. Some had both physical and mental disabilities so severe they required constant care. The Vietnamese called them the children of Agent Orange. These were not isolated cases. They numbered in the thousands, then tens of thousands, then hundreds of thousands. In areas that had been heavily sprayed, the rate of birth defects was several times higher than normal. Hospitals in Vietnam filled with children who would never have a normal life. The mechanism by which Agent Orange causes birth defects is now well understood. Dioxin interferes with normal fetal development. It affects gene expression, turning genes on or off at the wrong times. It disrupts the formation of organs and tissues. It crosses the placenta, so a pregnant woman exposed to dioxin will pass it to her developing baby. But more than that, dioxin accumulates in fat tissue and can be stored in the body for years. A woman who was exposed to Agent Orange as a child might not have children until decades later, but the dioxin stored in her body can still affect her babies. This means that Agent Orange is not just a first-generation problem. It affects children who were not born until years or decades after the spraying stopped. Studies in Vietnam have shown elevated rates of birth defects in the third generation, the grandchildren of people who were exposed. For American soldiers serving in Vietnam, exposure to Agent Orange was routine and unavoidable. Soldiers walked through jungles that had been sprayed. They drank water from streams contaminated with herbicides. They ate food that had been exposed. Some soldiers were present during actual spraying operations, standing on the ground as the planes flew overhead, the mist settling over them. They were told it was safe. Military authorities insisted that Agent Orange posed no danger to humans, that it only affected plants. This was either an outright lie or catastrophic ignorance. The chemical companies that manufactured Agent Orange knew it was contaminated with dioxin. They knew dioxin was toxic, but they continued to produce and ship the herbicide, and the military continued to use it. The veterans of Operation Ranch Hand, the men who flew the spray missions and maintained the aircraft, had particularly intense exposure. They handled barrels of Agent Orange, often without protective equipment. They breathed the fumes. They got the chemical on their skin. The planes themselves became contaminated. The cargo holds where the herbicide was stored, the spray equipment, all saturated with dioxin. Maintenance crews would work inside these contaminated aircraft, breathing contaminated air, touching contaminated surfaces. Some of these men literally bathed in Agent Orange. There are photos from Vietnam showing soldiers using empty Agent Orange barrels to hold water for showers. They had no idea they were covering themselves with one of the most toxic substances on Earth. Ground troops also had significant exposure, though usually less intense than the ranch hand veterans. Infantrymen walking through recently sprayed jungles would brush against plants still wet with herbicide. They would set up camps in sprayed areas. They would swim in contaminated rivers. Some units were accidentally sprayed when operations were not properly coordinated, the planes releasing their cargo over areas where American troops were operating. These friendly fire incidents with chemical weapons were more common than the military admitted. Soldiers reported being caught in spray drift, seeing the mist settling over their positions, smelling the chemical, feeling it on their skin. They reported it to their commanders. They were told it was harmless. In the years after the war, these veterans began to get sick. The pattern was clear to anyone paying attention, but for years, no one in authority paid attention. Veterans developed the same cancers that were appearing in Vietnamese populations: soft tissue sarcomas, lymphomas, lung cancer, prostate cancer. These were men in their 30s and 40s, too young to be developing these cancers at such rates. They also developed a condition called chloracne, a severe skin condition specifically associated with dioxin exposure. This was actually one of the clearer markers of Agent Orange exposure because chloracne is rare and distinctive. But even with this obvious connection, the VA initially refused to accept that Agent Orange was causing health problems. The children of Vietnam veterans also began to show elevated rates of birth defects. Spina bifida, a condition where the spinal cord does not form properly, heart defects, cleft palate, limb abnormalities. The pattern was similar to what was being seen in Vietnam, though generally less severe because the exposure levels for American soldiers were lower than for Vietnamese civilians living in heavily sprayed areas. But the connection was undeniable. Vietnam veterans were having children with serious birth defects at higher rates than the general population. Something they had been exposed to in Vietnam was causing genetic or developmental damage that affected their children. The response from the Department of Defense and the Veterans Administration was denial. For years, they refused to acknowledge any connection between Agent Orange exposure and health problems. They claimed that the herbicide was safe. They claimed that the exposure levels were too low to cause harm. They claimed that there was no scientific evidence linking Agent Orange to cancer or birth defects. All of these claims were false. The evidence was accumulating rapidly. Independent scientists were studying Agent Orange and finding clear connections to disease. But the government ignored this research or dismissed it as flawed. The chemical companies that manufactured Agent Orange also denied responsibility. Monsanto, Dow Chemical, and the others claimed they were simply fulfilling government contracts, that the specifications came from the military, that they bore no liability for how the product was used. They also claimed that Agent Orange was safe when used properly, implying that any problems were due to misuse by the military. This was a cynical legal strategy designed to shift blame. The companies knew their product was contaminated with dioxin. Internal documents later revealed that Monsanto and Dow had conducted studies showing dioxin was toxic and that Agent Orange was dangerous. They kept this information secret and continued to produce and sell the herbicide. The first major push for recognition and compensation came from the veterans themselves. In the late 1970s, Vietnam veterans began to organize. They formed advocacy groups. They held protests. They demanded that the VA acknowledge Agent Orange exposure and provide health care and disability benefits. These veterans were fighting an uphill battle. The VA is a large, slow-moving bureaucracy. It is also an institution that has historically been reluctant to acknowledge new conditions or expand benefits. Every new recognized condition costs money. The VA budget was already strained by the number of Vietnam veterans seeking care. Acknowledging Agent Orange would mean hundreds of thousands more disability claims, billions of dollars in additional spending. The institutional incentive was to deny, delay, and minimize. In 1979, a major class action lawsuit was filed against the chemical companies that manufactured Agent Orange. The case was brought on behalf of 2.4 million American veterans who served in Vietnam. The lawsuit alleged that the companies had negligently manufactured a defective product and failed to warn about its dangers. The legal battle dragged on for years. The chemical companies fought hard, employing the best lawyers money could buy. They argued that the government contractor defense should shield them from liability, that they were simply following specifications provided by the military. They argued that causation could not be proven, that there was no definitive proof that Agent Orange caused the specific diseases the veterans had developed. They used every delay tactic, every legal maneuver available. In 1984, the case was settled out of court on the eve of trial. The chemical companies agreed to pay $180 million to create a settlement fund for veterans. This sounds like a lot of money until you divide it among 2.4 million veterans. The average payout was about $1,200 per veteran. For men who were dying of cancer, who had children with severe disabilities, who faced enormous medical bills and lost wages, $1,200 was an insult. The settlement also prevented any future lawsuits. By accepting the settlement, veterans gave up their right to sue the chemical companies ever again. Many veterans felt betrayed by their own lawyers, who had negotiated what seemed like an inadequate settlement without consulting their clients. The settlement did not resolve the larger issue of VA benefits. The VA continued to deny that Agent Orange caused health problems. Veterans applying for disability benefits based on Agent Orange exposure were routinely rejected. The burden of proof was placed on the veteran. You had to prove that you were exposed to Agent Orange. You had to prove that your disease was caused by that exposure. Both of these were nearly impossible for most veterans. Service records often did not specify which units operated in sprayed areas. Medical records from Vietnam were incomplete or lost. The VA used this lack of documentation as a reason to deny claims. The turning point came in the late 1980s and early 1990s. Public pressure forced Congress to act. In 1991, Congress passed the Agent Orange Act, which fundamentally changed how the VA handled these claims. The law required the VA to accept scientific evidence linking Agent Orange to specific diseases. It created a presumptive service connection for certain conditions, meaning that if a veteran served in Vietnam and developed one of these conditions, exposure to Agent Orange would be presumed and benefits would be granted without the veteran having to prove exposure or causation. This was a major victory for veterans. The initial list of presumptive conditions was short, but it grew over time as more research was completed. Today, the VA recognizes about 15 conditions as presumptively connected to Agent Orange exposure. These include various cancers, type 2 diabetes, ischemic heart disease, Parkinson's disease, and several others. Veterans who developed these conditions and who served in Vietnam during the spraying period are eligible for disability compensation and health care. But the process is still not easy. Claims can take months or years to process. The VA still denies many claims on technicalities. Veterans still have to fight for their benefits. And the compensation, while better than the 1984 settlement, is often inadequate for the severity of the diseases and disabilities involved. The situation for Vietnamese victims of Agent Orange is far worse. The Vietnamese government estimates that approximately 3 million Vietnamese people have been affected by Agent Orange. This includes people who were directly exposed during the war and subsequent generations born with birth defects. The Vietnamese have received virtually no compensation or assistance from the United States. After the war ended in 1975, relations between the US and Vietnam were hostile for decades. There was no mechanism for Vietnamese victims to seek compensation. The chemical companies certainly were not going to pay. The US government took the position that any damages caused during the war were just the unfortunate consequences of warfare, not something that required compensation. Vietnamese victims filed their own lawsuit against the chemical companies in 2004. The case was dismissed by American courts. The judge ruled that the use of Agent Orange did not violate international law at the time it was used, that the chemical companies were government contractors and therefore immune from liability, and that the plaintiffs could not prove that their specific injuries were caused by Agent Orange rather than by other factors. This ruling was controversial, and many legal scholars disagreed with the reasoning, but it stood. The Vietnamese plaintiffs appealed several times. Each appeal was rejected. The door to legal compensation for Vietnamese victims was closed. The humanitarian situation in Vietnam for Agent Orange victims is dire. There are children and adults living in institutions, unable to care for themselves, suffering from severe physical and mental disabilities caused by dioxin exposure. There are families bankrupted by medical costs trying to care for disabled children. There are areas of Vietnam where the soil is still contaminated, where dioxin levels remain dangerous decades after the spraying stopped. The Vietnamese government provides some assistance, but Vietnam is a poor country. The resources available for Agent Orange victims are inadequate. International organizations provide some help. Several American nonprofit organizations, staffed partly by Vietnam veterans who feel a moral obligation to help, work in Vietnam providing medical care, building care facilities, and funding research. But the scope of the need far exceeds the available resources. The scientific understanding of Agent Orange and dioxin has evolved significantly since the 1960s. We now know that TCDD is one of the most potent carcinogens known. We know that it disrupts endocrine function, interfering with hormones that regulate growth, development, and reproduction. We know that it bioaccumulates, meaning it concentrates as it moves up the food chain. We know that it persists in the environment, with a half-life in soil of 10 to 12 years, meaning that contaminated areas remain dangerous for decades. We know that it crosses the placental barrier and is transferred through breast milk, exposing infants to their mother's stored dioxin. We know that it affects gene expression through epigenetic mechanisms, potentially explaining how effects can be passed to subsequent generations, even though dioxin does not directly damage DNA. Epidemiological studies have confirmed elevated disease rates in populations exposed to Agent Orange. Studies in Vietnam have documented higher rates of cancer, birth defects, and other conditions in areas that were heavily sprayed. Studies of American veterans have found elevated rates of specific cancers and other diseases compared to veterans who did not serve in Vietnam. Studies of the ranch hand veterans who had the highest exposure levels have found significantly elevated rates of diabetes, peripheral neuropathy, and other conditions. These studies are not perfect. It is difficult to control for all variables in human populations, but the weight of evidence is overwhelming. Agent Orange causes serious health problems. The mechanism of injury from dioxin is complex and still not fully understood. At the molecular level, dioxin binds to a protein called the aryl hydrocarbon receptor, which is found in cells throughout the body. This binding triggers a cascade of cellular effects. Genes that should be turned off get turned on. Genes that should be turned on get turned off. Cells divide when they should not, leading to cancer. Cells die when they should not, leading to developmental defects. The immune system is disrupted, making people more vulnerable to infections and possibly to autoimmune diseases. The timing of exposure matters enormously. Exposure during fetal development, when cells are rapidly dividing and tissues are forming, has more severe effects than exposure in adulthood. But adult exposure still causes significant harm, particularly increasing cancer risk. The environmental contamination in Vietnam remains a serious problem today. There are hotspots, areas where Agent Orange was stored or where barrels leaked, where dioxin concentrations in soil are dangerously high. The most contaminated area is the former U.S. Air Base at Da Nang, where Agent Orange was stored in large quantities. Soil samples from the site have shown dioxin levels thousands of times higher than safe limits. People living near the site have elevated dioxin levels in their blood. Fish from nearby waterways are contaminated. The Vietnamese government, with some international assistance, has undertaken remediation efforts. This involves excavating contaminated soil and treating it with heat to break down the dioxin. This process is slow and expensive. So far, only a fraction of the contaminated sites have been cleaned up. The cost of fully addressing the Agent Orange legacy in Vietnam would be enormous. Estimates run into the billions of dollars for complete environmental cleanup. Medical care and support for affected individuals would cost additional billions. The United States has provided some limited funding for Agent Orange-related programs in Vietnam, but it amounts to a few $1,000,000 per year, a tiny fraction of what is needed. This limited assistance is framed as humanitarian aid, not as compensation or acknowledgement of legal liability. The U.S. government remains unwilling to accept full responsibility for the damage caused by Agent Orange in Vietnam. The question of responsibility is central to understanding the Agent Orange tragedy. Who is responsible? The chemical companies that manufactured a product they knew was contaminated with a deadly toxin. The military commanders who ordered the spraying despite evidence of harm. The politicians who approved and funded Operation Ranch Hand. The answer is all of the above, but the diffusion of responsibility has allowed everyone involved to avoid full accountability. The chemical companies blame the government for the specifications. The military blames the chemical companies for the contamination. The politicians claim they relied on assurances from experts that the herbicide was safe. Everyone points fingers at everyone else, and the victims are left without justice. The moral dimension of Agent Orange use is even more troubling. Setting aside questions of legal liability, there is a moral obligation to help people you have harmed. American use of Agent Orange caused immense suffering. Millions of people have been affected. The harm continues to this day and will continue for generations to come. Even if one accepts the argument that Agent Orange use was legal under the laws of war at the time, which is debatable, there remains a moral duty to provide assistance to the victims. The United States has largely failed in this moral duty. The assistance provided to Vietnamese victims has been minimal. Even the assistance provided to American veterans, while better than what Vietnamese received, has been inadequate and came only after decades of struggle. The comparison with other chemical weapons is instructive. After World War I, the use of chemical weapons in warfare was banned by international treaty. The Geneva Protocol of 1925 prohibited the use of asphyxiating, poisonous, or other gases in war, but the protocol did not specifically address herbicides. The US argued that Agent Orange was not a chemical weapon because it was not intended to directly kill or injure humans. It was a defoliant, a tool for vegetation management, not a weapon. This was a legalistic distinction without moral meaning. Agent Orange was used as a weapon of war. It was intended to deny the enemy resources and to drive civilians out of contested areas. The fact that it killed plants first and people second does not make it less of a weapon. International law has evolved since Vietnam. The use of herbicides in warfare is now more clearly restricted. The 1977 Additional Protocol I to the Geneva Conventions prohibits methods of warfare that cause widespread, long-term, and severe damage to the natural environment. Agent Orange clearly meets this standard. If Agent Orange were used today in the same way it was used in Vietnam, it would likely be considered a war crime. But there is no retroactive application of these laws. Those responsible for Agent Orange use in the 1960s and 1970s cannot be prosecuted under laws that were clarified later. This is a frustrating reality for those seeking justice, but it is a fundamental principle of law. The psychological impact of Agent Orange extends beyond the physical diseases. Veterans who believe their exposure to Agent Orange caused their illnesses or their children's birth defects often experience guilt, anger, and depression. They feel betrayed by their government, which sent them to war and exposed them to toxins and then denied responsibility. They feel guilty about their children's suffering. They feel angry that the chemical companies and officials who knew the risks faced no consequences. These psychological burdens add to the physical suffering from disease. Mental health problems are common among Agent Orange victims, though often overlooked in discussions that focus on cancer and birth defects. Vietnamese families affected by Agent Orange face similar psychological challenges, compounded by poverty and lack of support services. Parents caring for severely disabled children face immense stress. Many marriages break up under the strain. The stigma associated with disability in some Vietnamese communities adds another layer of difficulty. Families with Agent Orange victims sometimes face discrimination. Young people from affected families may have difficulty finding marriage partners because of fears about birth defects in future generations. These social and psychological impacts are hard to quantify, but they are very real. The intergenerational effects of Agent Orange are particularly tragic. Consider a child born in Vietnam in 1970 in the midst of the spraying campaign. This child grows up in a contaminated environment, drinking contaminated water, eating food from contaminated soil. The dioxin accumulates in her body. She survives childhood and has children of her own in the 1990s. Those children have higher rates of birth defects because of the dioxin their mother was exposed to decades earlier. Then these grandchildren reach adulthood and have children in the 2010s, and there is evidence that the great-grandchildren also have elevated rates of developmental problems. 4 generations affected by exposure that occurred 50 years ago. This is the reality of Agent Orange. The research into Agent Orange has been extensive, but there remain gaps in our understanding. Most research has focused on adult male veterans or on the most severe birth defects. Less attention has been paid to subtler effects, cognitive impairments, learning disabilities, behavioral problems that might be linked to dioxin exposure. Less attention has been paid to women, both Vietnamese women who were directly exposed and the wives of American veterans who may have been exposed through their husbands. Dioxin is stored in fat tissue and can be released during weight loss or pregnancy. A veteran coming home from Vietnam could transfer dioxin to his wife through intimate contact. This secondary exposure is not well studied, but may be significant. The lessons of Agent Orange should have changed how America conducts warfare, but it is not clear that they have. The US military still uses herbicides in some contexts, though not on the scale of Vietnam and with much stricter safety standards. The broader lesson that chemicals released into the environment can have long-lasting and unpredictable effects seems to have been learned imperfectly. The burn pits used in Iraq and Afghanistan, where waste was incinerated in open pits releasing toxic smoke, have created a new generation of veterans with illnesses similar to Agent Orange victims. The military assured troops that burn pit smoke was safe. Veterans are now sick, and the VA is once again denying claims and resisting the connection between exposure and illness. The pattern repeats. The question of how to prevent future Agent Orange-type disasters is complex. Stronger international law is part of the answer. The Chemical Weapons Convention and other treaties have strengthened prohibitions on toxic chemicals in warfare, but law alone is not enough. There must be institutional cultures that prioritize long-term safety over short-term military advantage. There must be accountability for officials and corporations that put people at risk. There must be systems to monitor health effects and to respond quickly when problems emerge. None of this existed during the Agent Orange era, and it is not clear that it exists adequately now. The continuing fight for compensation and health care for Agent Orange victims is ongoing. In the United States, veterans groups continue to push for the addition of more conditions to the VA's list of presumptive diseases. There are conditions that appear to be linked to Agent Orange based on scientific evidence, but which the VA has not yet recognized. Each addition to the list is hard-fought, requiring legislation or regulatory action. The chemical companies that manufactured Agent Orange still exist, though some have been acquired by larger corporations. They have never admitted wrongdoing. They have never apologized. They have paid no compensation beyond the 1984 settlement that was negotiated before most of the health effects were known. In Vietnam, the situation has improved marginally but remains inadequate. The Vietnamese government has built care centers for severely disabled Agent Orange victims. These facilities provide housing, medical care, and therapy for people who cannot care for themselves, but the facilities are overcrowded and underfunded. Many families cannot access care centers and must provide care at home without adequate support. Vietnamese NGOs work to help Agent Orange families, but their resources are limited. American organizations, including some Vietnamese American groups and veterans organizations, raise money to support programs in Vietnam, but the need vastly exceeds the available help. The reconciliation between the United States and Vietnam, which began in the 1990s and has progressed steadily, has not included adequate resolution of the Agent Orange issue. When the US and Vietnam normalized diplomatic relations in 1995, Agent Orange was a contentious topic. The Vietnamese raised it repeatedly. The Americans acknowledged it as a humanitarian concern, but refused to accept legal liability. Trade and security interests took priority over Agent Orange. The relationship improved. American companies invested in Vietnam. Military cooperation increased. But for Agent Orange victims, little changed. They were sacrificed on the altar of diplomatic convenience. The environmental cleanup efforts, while important, have been slow and partial. The Da Nang Air Base cleanup project, conducted jointly by the US and Vietnamese governments, took years and cost tens of millions of dollars. It was completed in 2018. The project successfully reduced dioxin levels at the site, but Da Nang was just one site. There are dozens of other former US military bases and storage areas that remain contaminated. There are also the vast areas of jungle and farmland that were sprayed, where dioxin persists in soil and sediment. Complete cleanup is probably impossible and would cost billions of dollars. The question becomes one of priorities and resources. How much is the US willing to spend to remediate the damage it caused? The healthcare infrastructure in Vietnam is not equipped to handle the continuing Agent Orange crisis. Vietnamese doctors and nurses do what they can, but they lack resources. Advanced medical technology is scarce. Medications are expensive. Specialized care for complex disabilities is limited. Families often go into debt paying for medical care. The psychological support services that would help families cope are virtually non-existent. The result is that many Agent Orange victims do not receive appropriate care. They suffer unnecessarily. They die prematurely. Their families are impoverished by medical costs. The story of Agent Orange is also a story about information and transparency. For decades, crucial information was hidden or suppressed. The chemical companies knew their product was contaminated with dioxin, but did not inform the government or the soldiers who would be exposed. The military knew that Agent Orange was being sprayed over populated areas, but claimed only military targets were hit. The government knew that veterans were getting sick, but claimed there was no proof Agent Orange was responsible. The pattern of denial, secrecy, and misinformation delayed help for victims and allowed harm to continue. This pattern is not unique to Agent Orange. It appears repeatedly when governments and corporations are confronted with evidence that their actions have caused harm. The role of science in the Agent Orange story is ambiguous. Science eventually helped establish the connection between dioxin exposure and disease, providing the evidence that forced recognition of the problem. But science was also used as a weapon by those seeking to deny responsibility. The chemical companies and the government funded studies designed to cast doubt on the Agent Orange link. They emphasized uncertainty and the difficulties of proving causation in human populations. They demanded levels of proof that were unrealistic. This manufactured doubt delayed action for years. It is a tactic used in many environmental health controversies. Create enough scientific uncertainty and you can avoid responsibility indefinitely. The personal stories of Agent Orange victims are heartbreaking and necessary to understand the human cost. There is the story of a Vietnamese woman born near a sprayed area in 1968. She seemed healthy as a child, but when she had her own children in the 1990s, both were born with severe disabilities. One has no arms, the other is severely mentally disabled. The woman spends her entire life caring for these children. She has no job. The family lives in poverty. She has received almost no government assistance. She will spend her entire life caring for her children who will never be independent. This is her life sentence for the crime of being born in the wrong place at the wrong time. There is the story of an American veteran who served as a helicopter door gunner in Vietnam. He flew dozens of missions over areas that had been sprayed with Agent Orange. He remembers the dead jungle, the brown wasteland where forest used to be. He remembers the smell of the herbicide. He came home, married, had children. His daughter was born with a cleft palate and heart defects. She underwent multiple surgeries as a child. His son seemed healthy until his teenage years when he developed lymphoma. The son survived but had long-term health problems from the cancer treatment. The veteran himself developed diabetes and prostate cancer. He spent years fighting with the VA for benefits. He received some compensation, but nothing that made up for what his family went through. He died in 2015, still angry at what had been done to him and his children. There is the story of a Vietnamese boy born in 2005, decades after the spraying stopped. He was born without legs and with severely deformed arms. His mother had never been directly exposed to Agent Orange, but her father, the boy's grandfather, lived in a heavily sprayed area during the war. The dioxin passed through 2 generations. The boy will never walk. He will never feed himself. He requires constant care. His family loves him, but they struggle. The cost of his care consumes their income. The boy is intelligent, trapped in a body that does not work. This is his life. He did nothing to deserve it. His suffering is the direct result of decisions made by American officials before he was born, before his mother was born. These stories could be multiplied thousands of times. Each victim has a story. Each family has been torn apart by Agent Orange. The statistics: 3 million Vietnamese affected, 500,000 American veterans affected. These numbers are abstractions. Behind each number is a human being who has suffered. A child who died young from cancer. A baby born so deformed that survival is impossible. An adult slowly dying from diabetes or heart disease. An elderly veteran watching his grandchildren and wondering if they too will be affected by the poison he was exposed to 50 years ago. These are real people, not statistics. Their suffering is real. Their anger is justified. The question of what should happen now is difficult. The past cannot be changed. The millions of gallons of Agent Orange that were sprayed cannot be unsprayed. The people who have died cannot be brought back. The children born with defects cannot be unborn, but something can and should be done for those still living. The United States should establish a comprehensive fund to provide medical care and support for all Agent Orange victims, Vietnamese and American. This fund should be adequate to meet the need, not the token amounts currently provided. It should be funded by the U.S. government as acknowledgement of responsibility and by the chemical companies as acknowledgement of their role. This will be expensive. It will cost billions of dollars, but it is the right thing to do. The United States should fully fund the cleanup of contaminated sites in Vietnam. This should not be presented as aid, but as remediation of damage the U.S. caused. The cleanup should be comprehensive, addressing all known hotspots and contaminated areas. This too will be expensive, but the cost should be measured against the moral obligation to clean up one's mess. Environmental contamination that continues to harm people decades after it was created is a continuing wrong that must be addressed. The United States should issue a formal apology to the Vietnamese people for the use of Agent Orange. This apology should acknowledge that Agent Orange use caused immense and unjustified suffering, that it violated principles of humanity if not the letter of international law at the time. An apology does not erase harm, but it acknowledges it. It allows for the possibility of healing. The refusal to apologize, the continued evasion of responsibility, keeps the wound open. The chemical companies should be held accountable. The 1984 settlement should be revisited and overturned if possible. The companies should pay fair compensation to all victims, Vietnamese and American. They should fund research into long-term effects of dioxin exposure. They should fund medical care. They profited from manufacturing Agent Orange. They should pay for the consequences. If current law shields them from liability, then the law should be changed. Corporations that sell products they know are dangerous and that cause massive harm should not be able to hide behind legal technicalities. The likelihood of any of these things happening is unfortunately low. There is no political will in the United States to spend billions of dollars on Agent Orange victims. The chemical companies will fight tooth and nail against any attempt to reopen the compensation question. The Vietnamese government has other priorities in its relationship with the United States. Agent Orange victims have no powerful constituency advocating for them. They are the forgotten victims of a forgotten war. Their suffering continues in silence. The Agent Orange tragedy teaches several lessons. It teaches that modern warfare has consequences that extend far beyond the battlefield and far beyond the duration of the conflict. Decisions made in wartime can poison people for generations. It teaches that governments and corporations will lie to protect themselves, will deny obvious harms, will prioritize their own interests over the well-being of victims. It teaches that justice delayed is justice denied. The decades it took to get even limited recognition and compensation for American veterans meant that many victims died without help. It teaches that the vulnerable, the poor, the defeated, those without power or voice, will be ignored. Vietnamese victims have received virtually nothing because they lack the power to compel the United States to help them. But the story also teaches that persistence and solidarity can achieve at least partial justice. American veterans organized. They fought for decades. They eventually won recognition of Agent Orange-related conditions and compensation for themselves. Vietnamese victims and their advocates continue to fight. They have not won yet, but they have not given up. The story is not over. As long as Agent Orange victims live, as long as children are born with defects caused by dioxin exposure, the story continues. And as long as the story continues, there is the possibility, however slim, that justice will eventually be done. The Agent Orange legacy is a permanent scar on American history and on the history of modern warfare. It is a reminder that advanced technology and military power do not guarantee wisdom or morality. It is a reminder that the costs of war are paid not just by soldiers, but by civilians, by children, by generations yet unborn. It is a reminder that chemical warfare, even when dressed up as herbicide use and justified by military necessity, is a crime against humanity. And it is a reminder that those who commit such crimes have an obligation to make amends, an obligation that the United States has largely failed to meet. The poison continues to work its way through generations. The suffering continues, and the response continues to be inadequate. We did nothing or close to nothing, and that failure will haunt us as long as Agent Orange continues to kill and maim and destroy lives. This is not ancient history. This is happening now. People are suffering now because of Agent Orange. Children are being born with defects now, and we continue to do far less than we should. That is the true tragedy of Agent Orange.